A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello there, and welcome to the Power of Zero show. I am your host, David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You Lerp, The Volatility Shield, and Tax-Free Income for Life, all of which can be bought in single copies on Amazon or wherever you buy fine books, or in bulk. You can go to davidmcknightbooks.com. You can mix and match titles and achieve bulk discounts. If you are looking for someone to help you navigate your way to the 0% tax bracket, why not head over to davidmcknight.com, opt in for a complimentary strategy session. We will connect you with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, among the very best tax-free retirement advisors in the nation, all of whom have been trained, vetted, qualified personally by me. And if you're an advisor that's looking to level up your game, head over to powerofzero.com, opt in for a free 3-part video series that will teach you how to transition your practice to a Power of Zero style practice. Okay, so we've got some relatively big news that has happened over the last 10 days or so, and it has huge repercussions potentially for the tax legislation that Joe Biden is attempting to push through before midterms. Remember, if he can't get it through before midterms, he's probably not going to get it, because it looks like Republicans on the right side of the aisle have a lot of momentum going into midterms. That may be in part because the way Joe Biden went about withdrawing from Afghanistan, he's lost, in every poll that I've seen, he's lost 8 or so approval points on a national basis. That may be part of it. It also may just be that after the midterms of a president's first term, or after the first 2 years of a president's first term, he generally loses either the Senate, the House, or both. And that's why there's such a huge urgency to get all of that legislation pushed through in the first 2 years. Now, another caveat, I sometimes get emails from people that say that I'm letting my politics showing. I try to take as neutral a political tone in these podcasts as I can. My job is not to criticize or critique the social programs that result from the spending that is being proposed. My job is to sort of lay out what I believe are the consequences of the spending and show what that impact may have on you personally for your retirement. Okay, so just by way of summary, we know that recently the Senate, backed by Joe Biden, remember the Senate is controlled by the Democrats because they have 50 seats plus Kamala Harris is the tie-breaking vote. So the Senate, backed by Joe Biden, has proposed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which seems to have broad bipartisan support, by the way, and a $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill, which is opposed almost completely on the Republican side of the aisle and has mixed backing on the left side of the aisle. We know that there's a divergent coalition of the Democrats who can't agree on what should go into that $3.5 trillion bill, or if it should even be that big. And so what they've done is they basically says, let's impose a deadline of September 30th to have an up or down vote on both pieces of legislation at the same time. In other words, they're not going to get the $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which everybody wants, unless they can vote on that $3.5 trillion human infrastructure package at the same time. So in other words, we're going to tie those two bills together and have an up and down vote at the same time. And they've imposed this artificial deadline of the end of September to be able to pull this off. In the face of all this drama, Joe Manchin, who is the senator out of West Virginia, he's sort of the maverick, straight shooting, tell it like it is senator who's a Democrat. He caucuses with the Democrats, but he tends to sort of march to the beat of his own drum. He pens an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal expressing substantial misgivings over not the infrastructure bill, which he was part of really helping to bring parties together to get approval on, but he is showing substantial misgivings to the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read portions of what he wrote, and then I'm going to provide some commentary. And then I'm going to show what I think. I'm going to read a different article by a guy named Jonathan Chait of The Intelligencer magazine, who's showing why this gambit on the part of Joe Manchin may not only bring down this $3.5 trillion proposal, human infrastructure proposal, but it could threaten Joe Biden's presidency. So let's jump into it. So Joe Manchin begins by saying the nation faces an unprecedented array of challenges and will inevitably encounter additional crises in the future. Yet some in Congress have a strange belief there is an infinite supply of money to deal with any current or future crisis, and that spending trillions upon trillions will have no negative consequence for the future. I disagree. So this is Dave opining now. He says he's not only hinting at the implications of what it would mean to borrow more money for our country, he's also hinting at the drawbacks of printing more money, which of course has echoes of modern monetary theory, which I decry on a regular basis. So it's not just the borrowing, but potentially the printing as well. He continues, an overheating economy has imposed a costly inflation tax on every middle and working class American. At $28.7 trillion and growing, the nation's debt has reached record levels. Over the past 18 months, we've spent more than $5 trillion responding to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, Democratic congressional leaders propose to pass the largest single spending bill in history with no regard to rising inflation, crippling debt, or the inevitability of future crises. Ignoring the fiscal consequences of our policy choices will create a disastrous future for the next generation of Americans. Okay, here's some commentary on my part. He is not really saying anything differently than what we've heard from, say, David Walker, Larry Kotlikoff, Maya McGinnis on this podcast. Basically, what he's saying is saying, look, when politicians make spending decisions without regard to the impact of those decisions on the future fiscal condition of our country, things generally don't turn out well. He continues, those who believe such concerns are overstated should ask themselves, what do we do if the pandemic gets worse under the next viral mutation? What do we do if there is a financial crisis like the one that led to the Great Recession, which of course was back in 2008, 2009? What if we face a terrorist attack or major international conflict? How will Americans respond to such crises if we needlessly spend trillions of dollars a day? So this is Dave opining. So here Manchin's appealing to this idea that if you spend all your money when things are going well, what are you going to do when we have a real crisis on our hands, when the coffers are empty? And of course, I would like to make the case that not only are the coffers empty, but they're empty to the tune of negative $28.7 trillion. He continues, instead of rushing to spend trillions on new government programs and additional stimulus funding, Congress should hit a strategic pause on the budget reconciliation legislation. A pause is warranted because it will provide more clarity on the trajectory of the pandemic, and it will allow us to determine whether inflation is transitory or not. While some have suggested this reconciliation legislation must be passed now, I believe that making budgetary decisions under artificial political deadlines never leads to good policy or sound decisions. I have always said, if I can't explain it, I can't vote for it, and I can't explain why my Democratic colleagues are rushing to spend $3.5 trillion. So this is, Dave again, this is really a key part of his article, okay? Because remember, by the time you hear this podcast, they have basically 2 weeks to hold that up or down vote in Congress on the $1 trillion and the $3.5 trillion, okay? And what he's basically saying is, look, we should pause. We should hold off on voting based on this artificial deadline. We should study this out. We should have a better understanding of what the implications of this bill might be for future generations. We need to figure out what the implications of inflation are going to be. So he's got all sorts of misgivings. He says we need to study this out. And of course, studying out longer doesn't bode well for a Democratic Congress who has imposed upon themselves this artificial deadline. And the second article I'm going to read today is going to sort of share with you why that could be potentially lethal for any sort of tax legislation that Joe Biden wants to push through. He says, another reason to pause, we must allow for a complete reporting and analysis of the implications of the multi-trillion-dollar bill will have for this generation and the next. Such a strategic pause will allow every member of Congress to use the transparent committee process to debate what should we fund and what can we simply not afford. I agree with this. I agree that you should not push through legislation unless you have a full understanding of the implications of that legislation. And if you feel like the voters will back you on that and you feel like it's important for the country, then you have to have enough political willpower to say, we are going to raise taxes to be able to afford this. Okay. And if you can't get your constituency to agree to raising those taxes, then you probably shouldn't be layering on all of this debt. He continues, I, for one, won't support a $3.5 trillion bill or anywhere near that level of additional spending without greater clarity about why Congress chooses to ignore the serious effects inflation and debt have on existing government programs. This is even more important now as the Social Security and Medicare trustees have sounded the alarm of these life-saving programs, that these life-saving programs will be insolvent and benefits could start to be reduced as soon as 2026 for Medicare and 2033, a year earlier than previously projected for Social Security. By the way, Dave, again, please note that David Walker, who understands this stuff pretty well, has said that the death of Medicare and Social Security accelerated by 3 years each, not 1 year. So there seems to be divergent opinions on the impact COVID-19 had on those two programs. So just so you understand, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. I would also say that please note that in this last paragraph, Joe Manchin did not say he won't support this bill. He simply said he won't support it unless he gets more clarity on its fiscal impact. And I think this is pretty key because this is fairly par for the course when it comes to Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin has a pattern, if you will, of putting up a lot of fight during the legislative process, objecting strenuously to various aspects of legislation, but almost every time he falls into line at the very end and ends up voting for the legislation. So just keep that in your mind as we continue along here. He says, continuing, establishing an artificial 3.5 trillion spending number and then reverse engineering the partisan social priorities that should be funded isn't how you make good policy. Undoubtedly, some will argue that bold social policy action must be taken now. While I share the belief that we should help those who need it the most, we must also be honest about the present economic reality. So just to be very clear here, Dave, again, he is not saying that he's not going to vote for a $3.5 trillion package. He's just saying that he's opposed to the price tag, and unless he gets more clarity on what the fiscal impact of this is going to be over time, he is not going to vote for it. So keep that in mind as this legislation comes up for a vote. He continues. Inflation continues to rise and is bleeding the value of Americans' wages and income. More than 10.1 million jobs remain open. Our economy, as the Biden administration has correctly pointed out, has reached record levels of quarterly growth. This positive economic reality makes clear that the purpose of the proposed $3.5 trillion in new spending isn't to solve urgent problems, but to re-envision America's social policies. So once again, what he's saying is that we typically spend $3.5 trillion. Well, there's nothing typical about $3.5 trillion, but we typically spend large amounts of money when our country is facing some sort of a crisis. And right now, given how well the economy is going, it's sort of humming right along. There's no clear and present danger to our country. And he says that this presents a very bad precedent. Okay, here's where Joe Manchin really hits his stride, in my opinion, where he really captures the essence of what's facing our country and why the $3.5 trillion number could be damaging to the long-term fiscal outlook of our country. He says, look, many in Washington have convinced themselves we can add trillions of dollars more to our nearly $29 trillion national debt with no repercussions. Regardless of political party, elected leaders are sent to Washington to make tough decisions and not simply go along to get along. Says Dave again, this is, of course, one of the primary themes of my podcast. If you want to spend money, make your case to the American people and then raise the revenue to do so. If the voters agree to an increase in taxes, then go ahead and pass the legislation required to bring those programs about. But don't just throw caution to the wind and pile it on to the national credit card. Joe Manchin again. For those who will dismiss my unwillingness to support $3.5 trillion bill as political posturing, I hope they heed the powerful words of Admiral Mike Mullen, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who called debt the biggest threat to national security. His comments echo the fear and concern I've heard from many economic experts I personally met with. And this, of course, echoes what David Walker said in his famous 2009 wake-up call piece on 60 Minutes. He says the biggest fiscal problem facing our nation is not a terrorist hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. This is, of course, back when they were looking for bin Laden. He says the biggest problem facing our country is our own fiscal irresponsibility. And so this is a theme that has been sounded over the years. So once again, Joe Manchin sounds a bit like me during this op-ed. He's not criticizing the desire to have social programs that would result from this legislation. He's simply discussing the financial implications of all of this additional spending. We spend lots of money when we're in a crisis, when the economy needs to be resuscitated, like back in 2008. I was actually okay with what they did back in 2008 because it sort of jump-started. It actually resuscitated the economy. The economy was on basically flatlining, and it resuscitated the economy. But we simply don't have the luxury of piling on another $3.5 trillion on top of everything we've accumulated so far. If this were Donald Trump doing it, or whoever the next candidate is on the Republican side of the aisle, I would be critiquing those proposals in very, very similar ways. So let's move on to an article by Jonathan Chait from The Intelligencer. The title of this article, and this article came out either the day after or 2 days after the article by Joe Manchin. It's called "Joe Manchin Has Put Joe Biden's Presidency in Mortal Danger." I'm going to read to you a couple of excerpts from that, and then we'll wrap this up. He says, the greatest danger posed by Manchin's pause gambit is that it will wreck the carefully negotiated strategy Democratic leaders have crafted. Facing moderate and progressive factions that don't trust each other, they set out to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill favored by the center and Biden's human capital bill favored by the left in tandem. The compromise negotiated in the House requires an expedited schedule with an infrastructure vote by the end of September. The sequence is still workable as long as both factions have an understanding of what they'll include in the social spending bill. Without that understanding in place, progressives have every incentive to vote down the infrastructure bill, which will in turn contribute to the impression of dysfunction and chaos. So once again, he's talking about how the decision to vote for these two bills in tandem and placing that artificial deadline in place of September 30th means that if there's any pause, any strategic pause, as Joe Manchin's alluding to, then that is going to contribute to the impression of dysfunction and chaos. And voters, frankly, going into a midterm do not like dysfunction and chaos. Jonathan Chait continues, the whole process hinges on Manchin figuring out what level of taxes and spending he can accept and allowing House Democrats to negotiate on that basis. His insistence on waiting freezes everything in place. Okay, so this is where Jonathan Chait is going to describe why a strategic pause on the part of Joe Manchin could be invariably fatal to these two bills. And if Joe Biden can't get these signature bills passed, then his whole presidency could go down right along with it. So Joe Manchin, in effect, has the ability, according to Jonathan Chait, to bring down the Joe Biden presidency. He says, the danger is that this pause sets off a cycle of failure. Wealthy interests are only belatedly mobilizing against the bill now. As Republican lobbyist Liam Donovan notes, the Democrats' best chance is to move as fast as possible. Delay creates the impression of dysfunction, making Biden and Congress less popular, in turn reducing the popularity of any bills they pass, in turn making Congress more reluctant to support it. Even if Manchin doesn't want to destroy Biden's presidency, he may do so by setting off a vortex of failure he loses the ability to escape. He concludes by saying the good news is that what Manchin tells reporters one day is not always a perfect guide to what he will say the next day. A needle measuring Manchin's utterances was always going to be an EKG, oscillating between health and cardiac arrest. But this is a signal, not noise. And the signal Manchin is sending is worrisome. For the first time, Biden is staring at the plausible vision of a failed presidency. Okay, so we see the dangers of a strategic pause in this legislation. But the bottom line is, why am I bringing this to your attention? I am bringing this to your attention because Joe Biden's tax proposal is part and parcel of this $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill. If he can't pass the bill, he doesn't get the tax increases required to pay for it. It's all going to be passed through budget reconciliation, all as part of the same package. So by the time you hear this podcast, it's September 15th, which means that Congress now has 2 more weeks to convince Joe Manchin that this bill is worth passing. And if he doesn't, then the entire ball of wax, including the tax legislation that goes along with it, could lose the momentum required to get this bill passed through Congress. So keep your ear to the ground for the next 2 weeks, as it will be absolutely instrumental in determining what happens to tax law in our country over the next 8 years. So remember, there's a couple of different things that could happen. The Trump tax cuts could expire January 1st, 2026. Joe Biden could, through budget reconciliation, extend those tax cuts for 8 more years through 2029. Or there could be, as Ed Slott says, there could be some sort of compromise in there where it happens much sooner. I tend to think that that's not very realistic. So in other words, there is trouble with the Biden tax bill. Joe Manchin is looking to play the foil. What do I happen to think on this? I happen to think that the Leopards don't typically lose their spots, and that Joe Manchin, even though he penned this fiscally conservative political column, historically he tends to he himself go along to get along. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next 2 weeks. So keep your ear to the ground. We will keep you posted on all of this, because this has huge repercussions for the speed with which you can shift your tax-deferred assets to tax-free. If we have 5 years to do it, you're going to have to shift your money faster, which could cause you to rise into a higher tax bracket. If we have through 2029, then you can do that relatively at your leisure. You can do it over 9 years, counting 2021, 2022, all the way up through 2029. Okay, that's the podcast for today. Thanks for tuning in. Once again, if you're looking for help navigating all of this, head on over to davidmcknight.com. Happy to hook you up with a member of our elite POZ advisor group. And if you're a financial advisor and want to integrate all of these concepts into your practice, head over to powerofzero.com, opt into our 3-part video series, and we will be happy to have a chat with you. And once again, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so. It's at McKnight & Co, at McKnight & Co. And we will look forward to chatting with you same time next week.